Donald Trump will reportedly make Republican Senator Marco Rubio his new Secretary of State, and consequently, CNN is having a hell of a time putting together all sorts of compilations of the terrible, brutal, nasty things that Trump and Rubio used to publicly say about each other during the 2016 Republican primary, and it's hilarious. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, this is big news. We're getting all sorts of high-level senior staff, cabinet-level positions and, assignments from the incoming Trump administration. And one of the big ones is Marco Rubio to the position of Secretary of State. We do have some clips to play, but I want to provide some context here because this will no doubt actually upset many Trump supporters for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being Marco Rubio is a lifelong neoconservative. And the whole thing about MAGA populism is that you're supposed to leave the neoconservative war hawk legacy of the Bush-era Republicans, the Reagan-era Republicans. You're supposed to leave that all behind and go with an America First Secretary of State. I should also note that Vivek Ramaswamy, of all people, was on the short list, but Trump will reportedly name Rubio one of his arch nemeses from the 2016 Republican primary. Before I get to the clip, I want to read this deep dive by the New York Times. Trump expected to name Marco Rubio Secretary of State. The president-elect appears to have settled on the Florida senator, who has taken hardline positions on China, Iran, Venezuela to be the nation's top diplomat. Donald Trump is expected to name Marco Rubio Florida as his Secretary of State, three people familiar with this thinking said on Monday, as Trump moves rapidly to fill out his foreign policy and national security team. Trump could still change his mind at the last minute, the people said, but appeared to have settled on Marco Rubio, whom he also considered to be his running mate earlier this year. Rubio was elected to the Senate in 2010 and has staked a position as a foreign policy hawk, somebody who's basically pro-strong military and disposition, a militaristic disposition as opposed to a dove, somebody who really emphasizes diplomacy and peace. Taking hard lines on China, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba in particular. He initially found himself at odds with those Republicans who were more skeptical about interventions abroad, but he's also echoed Trump more recently on issues like Russia's war against Ukraine, saying that the conflict has reached a stalemate and, quote, needs to be brought to a conclusion, end quote. Despite speaking in hardline terms about Russia in the past, Rubio would likely go along with Trump's expected plans to press Ukraine to find a way to come to a settlement with Russia and remain outside of NATO. It's unclear whether leaders of Ukraine or Russia would be prepared to enter into talks at Trump's urging. As a matter of fact, Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, recently had an interview where he went viral because he dropped the F-bomb during that interview, saying that, Ukraine is not going to give in to that effing terrorist Putin. So seems unlikely. Rubio has been among the most outspoken senators on the need for the U.S. to be more aggressive on China. He's adopted positions that later became more mainstream in both parties. For example, while serving in Congress during the first Trump administration, he began advocating industrial policy meant to help the United States better compete with China's state-directed economy. Rubio has also served as a co-chairman of the bipartisan Congressional Executive Commission on China, which is aimed to craft aggressive policy on China, especially in trying to address human rights abuses there. In 2020, Rubio sponsored a bill that tried to prevent the import of Chinese goods made with the use of forced labor by China's ethnic Uyghur minority. Biden signed it into law. President Biden signed it into law the next year. In 2019, Rubio helped persuade Trump to adopt harsh sanctions policy against Venezuela to try to unseat its authoritarian leftist president, Nicolas Maduro. Quote, he picked a battle he can't win, Mr. Rubio said of Maduro in an interview with the New York Times. Quote, it's just a matter of time. The only thing we don't know is how long it will take and whether it will be peaceful or bloody. Though Venezuelans have suffered from U.S. imposed sanctions, Mr. Maduro remains in power. Rubio's expressed unalloyed American support for Israel's war in Gaza. When asked by peace activists late last year what he thought about the many Palestinian civilian deaths, he said, quote, I think Hamas is 100% to blame. Rubio has worked across party lines on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Senate Intelligence Committee and would likely sail through a confirmation process. If he becomes Secretary of State, a main question is whether he would forego U.S. interventions in the part of the world to prioritize China. That approach would align with Trump's America First ideas, but would run counter to some of Rubio's earlier positions. Rubio was a loyal surrogate for Trump during the campaign, even after being passed over as the vice presidential pick. And then, of course, Rubio and Trump have declined to comment. Okay, so that's the background for this. Now, here's where the fun stuff kicks in. Okay, Marco Rubio ran against Donald Trump during the 2016 Republican primary. He, along with Ted Cruz and actually Lindsey Graham, even though Lindsey Graham was by far the last of the pack in terms of viability, they said some pretty funny, harsh, but often honest things about Donald Trump that they would now never, under any circumstances, ever utter. And so CNN's having a really fun time pointing out these contradictions, this change of tune and change of heart about Donald Trump. And so we're going to play some of the clips and the analysis from CNN, all of it very, very good.
People of what Matt was saying, because it is worth noting the relationship that Rubio and Trump have had over the years. They ran against each other for president in 2016. During that time, Trump once tweeted, quote, "Marco Rubio is a total lightweight who I wouldn't hire to run one of my smaller companies." I think we have this. We can put it up on the screen. A highly overrated politician. And then Marco Rubio, once on stage, went on a sort of rant about Donald Trump's fingers. Listen.
Which is why I don't understand why his hands are the size of someone who's 5'2". Have you seen his hands? They're like this. And you know what they say about men with small hands? You can't trust them.
All right. It just had to be played. That was a long time ago, though, Juliana. It does say something that politicians can move on, yes?
Well, Marco Rubio has moved on from every position he's ever held in immigration with respect to Donald Trump. Look, I'm a Democrat. Obviously, Marco Rubio is not my cup of tea, but I would say this was as good a pick as you can make for Donald Trump, except for one thing, and this applies to everybody in his administration. They're going to bend the knee to Donald Trump. He's going to run his own foreign policy. This is not a typical president who sits around with his cabinet and takes advice and listens to input. He has made up his mind. The people around him who are not his duly elected, not elected, but appointed cabinet members, like Elon Musk, probably will have a bigger say about foreign policy than Marco Rubio if passed as predicate. And so, again, for everybody celebrating this is kind of a normie pick that he's putting people in who are not necessarily MAGA. These are people who've consistently bent the knee to whatever Donald Trump wants, and he will be running policy himself. And from that perspective, I think this is kind of a virtue signaling pick to the quote unquote establishment, because the real establishment now is MAGA. And anybody who doesn't get on board, like Marco Rubio, will be out in 5 seconds, the same way that his predecessors were in the first administration.
Matt,
So again, that comports with much of what I believe as well. I should point out that the Secretary of State serves at the pleasure of the president. Now, to be a Secretary of State, you have to be confirmed by the Senate. But remember, number one, Marco Rubio is currently an incumbent Republican senator from Florida. And the Republicans will have a majority, not only a majority, but they'll have a surplus. I think they're expected to have a 53-person majority. And of course, J.D. Vance will be the vice president. So in the effect that there's some sort of tie when it comes to Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance will be there to break the tie in favor of Trump. But then after Marco Rubio becomes Secretary of State, if he doesn't toe the line, he can be fired at will at the drop of a hat by the president of the United States, which of course will be Donald Trump. But of course, that assumes that Marco Rubio will, hold steadfast to his neoconservative principles and push back on Trump, when there's really no reason to believe that that's the case. You got a taste of some of the things that Marco Rubio used to say about Trump and vice versa. But I've got some more clips just to really put it in context, to really illustrate, because sometimes we forget just how these Republican senators like Marco Rubio, like Ted Cruz, like Lindsey Graham have fallen.
Have you seen his hands? They're like this. And you know what they say about men with small hands? You can't trust them.
Look at those hands. Are they small hands? And he referred to my hands. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee it. So I looked at him, I said, Marco, those hands can hit a golf ball 285 yards. I wanted to show the size of my hands, how I could grab him.
Have you seen?
Those two are going to work together. Yeah. What have we become? I think there's more. Let's look at some more. Just again, to walk back memory lane and, see how far the Republican Party has fallen.
There is no way we are going to allow a con artist to take over the conservative movement, and Donald Trump is a con artist.
Donald Trump is a con artist.
He's a con man. I think it's time to unmask him for what he is. A con man who's taking advantage of people's fears and anxieties about the future, portraying himself as some sort of strong guy. He's not a strong guy.
He doesn't sweat. He doesn't sweat because his pores are clogged from the spray tan that he uses.
You all have friends that are thinking about voting for Donald Trump. Friends, do not let friends vote for con artists.
And it goes on like that. The bottom line is that Marco Rubio had the measure of Donald Trump back in 2016 and told the truth about him. But now he's bent the knee. He has totally suborned his principles to political expedience. And he's not alone, right? We talked about this. It's Mitch McConnell. It's Lindsey Graham. It's Ted Cruz. It's so many of them. Donald Trump was reviled and probably still is by much of the Republican Party's elected class. But now they're terrified of him. And so, again, what's interesting about this pick is, yes, in many respects, Marco Rubio is the normie pick, as the CNN contributor pointed out. But I think it also risks potential backlash because so much of Trump's MAGA populist base doesn't want somebody like Marco Rubio. They want somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy. They want an outsider. They want a disruptor. They want Tulsi Gabbard, right? They somebody like that. Marco Rubio is a neocon hawk. And I guess the calculus is, well, and you know what? This is probably what it is. I'm actually working this out in real time. What it probably is Trump knows that when push comes to shove, Marco Rubio will bend the knee and will totally pivot on any lifelong or, well-established principle he's ever had. So there's really no risk, to the backlash. The backlash will be short-lived. Oh, you have this neocon war hawk, Marco Rubio, and he's probably telling his supporters Trump is, no, don't worry about this. Actually, as a matter of fact, it's quite funny because you're going to see this man mutate in real time into a right-wing America First populist, not because he really believes it, but because he's such a spineless loser that's what he will do for my favor. And we can actually watch it and, and bask in it in real time. And I think that's really what this is. Rubio's not stupid, so Trump gets the benefit of his intelligence to the extent that there's any benefit to it at all. Number two, Rubio won't hold fast to his principles, which conflict with Trump. And number three, and this is probably the big one, because Rubio was a vicious critic of Trump in the 2016 Republican primary, Trump can yet again watch in real time him crushing a former rival and bringing him to heel in real time in front of the American people. So there's probably that schadenfreude, humiliation fetish in there as well. That's my guess. But yeah, this is very likely the future Secretary of State in the second Trump administration. Food for thought. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.